here we go.
Hello and welcome to News Desk. The conflict on the border between Israel and Lebanon has been on and off for decades. But since the Hamas terror attacks on Israel on October the 7th last year, relations between Lebanon's militant group Hezbollah and Israel appear to be at breaking point, with fears that there could be a full-scale war. Here's the head of the UN, Antonio Guterres, warning of just that.
I felt compelled today to voice my profound concerns about escalation between Israel and Hezbollah along the blue line. Escalation in continued exchanges of fire and escalation in bellicose rhetoric from both sides, as if an all-out war was imminent. The risk for the conflict in the Middle East to widen is real and must be avoided. One rash move, one miscalculation, could trigger a catastrophe that goes far beyond the border and, frankly, beyond imagination.
So Antonio Guterres there really spelling out what is at risk there on the border between Israel and Lebanon with that Lebanese militant group Hezbollah. Some countries like Canada, for example, have already told their citizens they need to get out of Lebanon.
Oh, really?
So it's been taken very, very seriously. And we are discussing all this today on News Desk. We're wondering, what could war be avoided? Is there a way even towards peace in that region? Hello, I'm Alex Forrest-Whiting.
And I'm Michelle Stockman, and I will be paying special attention to the chat today to look at your comments, to look at your questions, and make you a part of the discussion. And I thank the hundreds of you out there who have already commented on our community post. I want to highlight one exchange that really stood out to me. This is first between Shut Up 2751, I love that name, who said, "We can only hope that the prospect of so much destruction in the event of an Israel-Lebanon war would act as a deterrent against war." And responding to Shut Up is Tell Me More, who says, never will happen. So that leads me to you, Amian. You've been reporting in Israel and Lebanon over the past year. So should people be worried? Are we entering into new territory here?
Yeah, that is a very good question. Actually, I just had an idea. Can you share my screen right now? Because I have this really interesting map from the Washington Institute. And on this map, you can see basically all of the attacks, cross-border attacks that have occurred just since October 7th, when Hamas went on a rampage. Hamas, which is considered a terrorist organization by many Western countries, killing at over 700 civilians and several hundred IDF members, which triggered these cross-border attacks. Hezbollah striking first, Israeli troops retaliating. But look at all that. This is just since October 7th. Oh. Why has this not led to a war? I mean, in a lot of other countries, if one missile lands inside your territory, it escalates into an all-out war. But it hasn't, because there's these rules of engagement that have been going on basically since the last war between Hezbollah and Israel. Yeah. And it's something that both sides have basically tolerated. People who live in that border area don't live in their, they often have to flee their homes because of these missiles landing in their backyards or even on their houses sometimes. But why we're talking about this now is because of the rhetoric, basically. Starting just last week, things have ramped up very quickly to the point where Israel's foreign minister says they're on the verge of changing the rules of engagement here and are ready for a full-scale war. You had the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, saying that they had approved a plan to basically invade southern Lebanon and attack Hezbollah and settle this once and for all. Doesn't mean that the government has approved the plan and that they're going to go in, but basically they're saying we have a working plan, and at the snap of a finger we could go in and you'd be finished, Hezbollah. And Hezbollah basically said the same thing back to them, that they would fight a war without rules.
And we can hear some of that a bit later, can't we?
That's why this seems to be getting out of control, to where Antonio Guterres has to comment on this. A lot of people weighing in saying it's inevitable. Other people saying, wait. War is never inevitable. There's always a way to avoid this. And that's that's really the major conversation happening in the Middle East right now.
But it has been the norm that, it's normal that missiles are being traded back and forth, but what's got people worried is this ramping up of the rhetoric, which we're going to drill down into today. Right. So please, everybody, send us your questions about that so that we can ask Amian and the other people who will be joining us later. And Alex will introduce them in just a minute. First, I want to make sure that Sherry gets everybody voting on our poll question today.
Right. Our poll question today is: the escalation on the Lebanon-Israel border rests in whose hands? There are 4 options: Israel, Hezbollah, US and Iran, or conflict is inevitable. So don't forget to vote, and we will talk about the result later.
Great, thank you very much, Cherry. And as well as Amian, we've got some other good guests who will be joining us. We will have Rebecca Ritters, who is a DW correspondent. She's actually based in Jerusalem and has also spent time in Lebanon. So we'll be hearing from her shortly. And then a little bit later, we will be speaking to somebody who I'm very interested to hear from, and that's Makram Rabah from the American University of Beirut, and he will be helping us sort of look at this from a bit of a bigger standpoint, more of a geopolitical stand, and perhaps what role, for example, Iran and the US are playing in this. So do please stay with us for all of that. But Amian, first of all, to you, we've just heard you talking about why we are discussing this particular topic today. But I would really love to know how we got here in the first place. What's really kicked all this off in the past few months?
Well, let me start at 200 BC. No, I'm just kidding.
Oh, boy.
It's the thing with
this is going to be a long news desk, everybody. Get sitting down, get your water. No, go ahead,
Amian. I said keep it short, Amian.
Keep it short. I said 200 BC. I'm not going that far. No, as with a lot of conflicts in the Middle East, this goes back to colonial times. There's a lot of places that we could start, but obviously for the sake of brevity, I could start talking about the escalation from October 7th, because that's when we really saw a lot of these attacks happening that you saw on that map earlier. So October 7th, Hamas breaks across the Gaza border, massacres Israeli civilians, and military, takes 200 people hostage, and right afterwards, Israel starts bombing Gaza in a way that we haven't seen before, ever. Hezbollah is in Lebanon. It's the country that's north of Israel, has been involved in conflicts with Israel before. It's a militia, very powerful militia. It's not actually a part of the Lebanese military. It actually has a lot of disagreements with Lebanon, with the state of Lebanon and Lebanese military. But they are in solidarity with Hamas and with what they call the Palestinian cause. So right after Israel started bombing Gaza, Hezbollah, in solidarity, launched its own attack under the auspices of distracting Israel's military so that they're fighting a two-front war. This was announced. If you can show the map again, I think this is important. The place where that first strike happened, actually I can make this bigger. Yeah, here we go. I'm gonna make that bigger for you. The place where the first strike happened was here. This region, I'm gonna zoom out again, is actually an occupied, what internationally recognized occupied Lebanese territory. It's part of what the international community recognizes as Syria, but Syria says that actually belongs to Lebanon. It's called the Sheba Farms. So this was the place where they decided to get involved in the conflict. This first attack here by Hezbollah on an Israeli defense forces, I think it was a radar system, something like that. It was a military outpost. That triggered a retaliation from Israel. And since then, we've seen hundreds and hundreds of tit-for-tat retaliations between both sides. The death toll is actually way off balance. It's a lot of Hezbollah fighters have been killed. That number is well over 300 Hezbollah fighters, as well as over 80 Lebanese civilians in this border area that you can see here. And on the Israeli side, you have 25 deaths altogether, 10 civilians, and I think 15, where do I have it? I'm going to correct myself later if I can find that, but it's about half civilians and Israeli military. So how where we got in the last week was that after these kind of established rules of engagement, you saw an escalation where Hezbollah, they released this video, drone footage of Haifa, which is in Israel, basically bragging that we can fly a drone over this Israeli city and this very important international port, and Israeli military can't shoot us down.
We've got that, haven't we? I think
Yeah,
we
I
can
think we've
show
got that footage that we can show.
If that's possible.
It's a propaganda video, keep that in mind. We don't really know how they filmed it. But basically, they released this video, and the implication here is that if we can fly a drone over it to film it, we can also attack it. Israel was very concerned about this, and they responded very aggressively. Israel Katz, he tweeted, and if you can share my tweet, share my screen, and I can show you this tweet. He says basically that Nasrallah boasts today about filming the ports of Haifa operated by international companies from China and India and threatens to attack them. We are very close to the moment of decision to change the rules against Hezbollah and Lebanon. In an all-out war, Hezbollah will be destroyed and Lebanon will be severely hit. The state of Israel will pay a price on the front and home fronts, but with a strong and united nation and the power of the IDF, we will restore security to the residents of the north. Now, like I said earlier, this was followed by an announcement that they had drawn up a plan to invade. And then what you see most recently is that Netanyahu is saying that they're winding down the fighting in Gaza, and they're going to take some of that military power, the IDF soldiers who were fighting in Gaza, and move them to the northern border to secure that area and bring back the tens of thousands of Israelis who are forced to flee their homes. Keep in mind, people in Lebanon would also like to go back to their homes. Almost between 80 and 100,000 people are estimated to have left their homes in that area near the border.
Yeah, we've got a question from Doe97 here that relates to this. So you're talking about, both sides talking about escalating the conflict. The question here is, what is to gain on both sides in the case of the war?
There's a lot to gain and a lot to lose. And Israel Katz pointed this out in his tweet. It says that there would be a lot of losses on the home front and the military, acknowledging that there would be a lot of civilian deaths if they had an all-out war with Hezbollah. What's to gain on Hezbollah's side? They are basically, their whole ideology revolves around fighting with Israel. I mean, it was formed. We can talk a little bit later about what Hezbollah is, because that's a huge question. Everybody wants to weigh in on what Hezbollah is because it's kind of a unique thing. It's this super powerful militia that is a force of its own in the Middle East. It doesn't do what the Lebanese government wants it to do. Obviously doesn't do what Israel wants it to do. It basically does what Iran wants it to do. And Iran has every interest in keeping Israel distracted with a fight on its northern border so that it doesn't get involved in Iran's internal affairs. And so you could talk all day about what is the interest of Hezbollah, but basically Israel wants to secure its border and get rid of this shame of having 80,000 or I forget how many thousands of civilians have left the border area. When I was in Israel last time, we were in a hotel in Jerusalem, and there's families just living in hotels on government money. The government is sponsoring these families to live in hotels because they can't live in border towns, and they can't carry on their lives there, and the economy is dead. These are ghost towns because of the rockets being launched from Hezbollah.
I'd really like to hear from Hezbollah's reaction to what you were just saying, what the foreign ministry and then Netanyahu were talking about in terms of, moving troops closer.
Yeah, after this rhetoric was ramped up, of course, Nasrallah, Hassan Nasrallah, he's the head of Hezbollah. He's kind of a religious figure for Shia Muslims in Lebanon, and we can play what he had to say after this escalation.
They have to wait for us on the ground, in the air and in the sea. We have said this before, and I will say this again today. If the war's imposed on Lebanon, the resistance will fight without control, without rules and without a ceiling.
So pretty clear there. Yeah.
And what we'll talk about later in the scenarios of what is actually going on here, it's hard to tell what is deterrence and what is a threat.
Yeah.
Because a warning is not necessarily a threat. So when Israel says we've drawn up war plans, that's mostly meant to scare Hezbollah. And when Hezbollah says we would fight a war without rules, there's a little asterisk there, and he says if Israel starts the war, right?
Yeah.
So both sides are saying if the other side starts the war, we're going to go all out and destroy your country, et cetera, et cetera. But both sides so far have said we don't want an all-out war.
Well, this is a good point now to bring in Rebecca Ritters, who is a DW correspondent. She's based in Jerusalem. Hi, Rebecca. Thank you so much for being with us. And
Hi.
I think you were listening to some of that conversation already. And Amian did also mention what Netanyahu, that's the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, said, I think it was just on Sunday, actually, about moving his plans, possibly to move more troops to that border with Lebanon. Let's just listen to what he had to say, and then I'd love to get your reaction, Rebecca.
After the intense phase is finished, we will have the possibility to move part of the forces north, and we will do this, first and foremost for defensive purposes, and secondly to bring our evacuated residents home. If we can, we will do this diplomatically. If not, we'll do it another way. But we will bring all the residents home from both the north and the south.
I mean, it's within a month?
The end of the phase of intense fighting? Very soon.
So, Rebecca, what's your take on what Netanyahu was saying there?
Well, there's a couple of things to consider there, Alex. And one is, of course, who he's speaking to there. He's talking on this particular Israeli channel that is considered pretty much a Netanyahu mouthpiece, if you will. It's very favourable to Benjamin Netanyahu. And he's talking very much to his base. Now, that was actually the first interview he has done in Hebrew to the Hebrew media. And of course, he's under increased pressure to try to, like, as Amin was just saying, to get these people, these between 60 and 70,000 people that have been evacuated from along those border areas, or from along that border area, I should say, back to their houses. And there's a lot of anger among, well, obviously those communities, but wider into northern Israel and really across the country about the fact that these people have been out of their houses for so long and it's still not safe for them to return. So he's obviously speaking very much to his base there, and he's trying to get that opinion across in that first Hebrew media interview. Yeah, I mean, I think that's probably the most important thing about that particular interview that he did, but it's in keeping with what Amin was just discussing in this ramping up of rhetoric, and that is certainly something that he's been saying. But we, of course, know, and we've heard time and time again, that Benjamin Netanyahu is saying we are not going to leave Gaza until we finish Hamas. So that has been changing in recent days. We're now looking to this potential phase 3 of the Gaza war, and just what that entails, we don't exactly know yet, but it's certainly a withdrawal of a lot more, so that focus can be put more up onto that northern border.
And
we have a question,
we have
from
a question,
Carolina Vilena. Speaking, she's one of our viewers who loves to participate in News Desk, so I definitely want to get in a question from Carolina. Speaking of Netanyahu, there have been several, I would say, sources or people accusing him of prolonging the conflict so that he can maintain hold on power, meaning that conflict with Hamas. So the question is, if he expands into another conflict with Hezbollah, does that mean that he's just trying to stay in power, or will these conflicts end if Netanyahu steps down? That's what Carolina is asking. So I'll put that to you, Rebecca.
Okay. I mean, obviously, I don't have the crystal ball, so to be able to give a 100% answer is really difficult to say. But one thing is definitely true that, okay, yes, definitely Benjamin Netanyahu, it is the received wisdom. So many people here saying that he is trying to cling on to power. He doesn't want to face the music in a post-Gaza war scenario, and he is trying to keep these conflicts going. That's perhaps slightly too strong, but that he is in his political benefit to keep those going so that he doesn't have to face the commissions of inquiry into the failings that led to October 7 and his handling of the war and the hostage situation, the agreements there. But really, I mean, the war in Gaza and increasingly a potential war in the north is an opinion that much of the Israeli society, the military and the political elite are really on the same page, more or less, when it comes to these conflicts. I mean, it is still popular, although Israeli opinion is sort of shifting to accept a deal with Hamas because people really want to see those hostages returned, and they are pushing for that. That voice is certainly getting louder in Israel. But really, the support for the war remains strong. And from my reporting on the northern border and even polling that we've seen recently, support for a conflict in the north is also there. I think people see that as really, and it's inevitable. That's how people feel, and that is how they frame it to me when I've spoken to people in the north, that they feel that those communities just won't be able to go home. I've spoken to some people that were evacuated who said, it's not that we necessarily want war, but we will not move back even for a political solution. If there's a political solution, we still won't feel safe enough. That's what we had before, and we were seeing skirmishes on the border, and we don't think that's going to go away. Now we need to finish this. We need to push Hezbollah back before we'll return home. So I think even if Netanyahu were not in power, many of the decisions that are being made would remain the same.
And you've spent a lot of time as well, Rebecca, or some time in Lebanon, and that is a country in a very different situation. It's had an economic crisis, really struggling even with having a functioning government. What's the feeling there among the Lebanese about the possibility of there being a full-out war with Israel?
I haven't been to Israel for quite some time, but the people I have been speaking
Lebanon,
to...
you mean? You've been in Israel.
Sorry, to Lebanon. I'm living in Israel, obviously. I'm here. I haven't been to Lebanon for a couple of years now, but definitely when I speak to people from there, I mean, there's a great deal of fear. It's not something that the country can really handle. It is not in a position to be in an all-out conflict with Israel. It would certainly see a huge civilian death toll and infrastructure damage that it may not be able to recover from. Certainly not in the years to come. So there's obviously a lot of concern. It's not something that I would say the majority of Lebanese want to see happening. They are hoping for a diplomatic solution. They are hoping for a way out of this before, we're standing here on the precipice on the brink of war. They are hoping for a way out. I would say that is the received wisdom. That's certainly the majority view there. Now, that does fall a little bit along sectarian lines. I mean, there's a lot more support for Hezbollah within the Shia community. So that, the polling figures even show the discrepancy there. But by and large, the civilians, people on the street, they don't want to see a war with Israel.
I mean, is that... I know you haven't been there for a few months, but when you were in Lebanon, what was the feeling on the ground there just when all this was beginning to kick off in Gaza? Well,
it was extremely tense. I was in Beirut. I was sent there by DW, actually, to help the Bureau because there was a big speech by Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah. It was the first time he was speaking publicly since the October 7th terror attacks by Hamas after this kind of tit-for-tat had escalated. And people didn't really know how to interpret that. Was he going to give the speech and declare war on Israel, or was he going to de-escalate? So I went there not really knowing if the war was going to break out or not. And I was in Beirut, which is like a mosaic of religions and different political alliances and everything. And Hezbollah has a foothold in the south of Beirut, but really it's a diverse city. And a lot of people hate Hezbollah because they don't want a war with Israel. The country, like you said, is in economic ruins. They know that they would lose a war with Israel. Everybody knows that. Even Hezbollah knows that because their military just isn't big enough. They don't have the economic means. Well, I can just show you a video of kind of like what was happening at the time.
And this was back in...
This was the very beginning of November. So Nasrallah had released a statement on October 7th supporting Hamas, but he hadn't actually talked yet, and he hadn't really. Talks by Nasrallah are this huge thing in Lebanon because he makes these big speeches that last like an hour and a half, and sometimes he says something that scares everybody, like there's going to be war. Sometimes he kind of de-escalates, and he has a lot of supporters in Beirut who, if you can play this video, you can see this is something I posted to Instagram, but basically you could see him on the TV. He had just finished speaking. You can't hear it so well, but people are firing rifles into the air. So this is a tradition in Lebanon when Nasrallah speaks.
So it was just after he had stopped speaking then?
Just when he started
Just when he started.
They were celebrating it. So it was like our leader is speaking and they start firing rifles into the air. A lot of his supporters had gathered. But basically he spoke for an hour and a half, and what he said was, we're in solidarity with Hamas, but we had nothing to do with it. They didn't know about the attack. He said, we're not going to do anything more than we're doing because we're already fighting for Hamas. He said that we're obeying the rules of engagement with Israel, and we're not going to go beyond that. And so basically he said a lot without saying anything. And somebody even tweeted afterwards that the Nasrallah speech could have been an email. That went viral because it was a lot of nothing. And people were relieved. There was like literally some journalists went out for drinks afterwards because they're like, hey, World War III didn't start. So it was a big celebration because it is so weird to see in Beirut how Hezbollah, which is this powerful militia, is hated by so many people because they feel like it's this wild card that could start a war with their powerful neighbor and get them all killed. I mean, it wouldn't be the first time Israel has bombed Beirut and killed a lot of civilians, so they don't want that to happen again.
And can I ask a clarifying question here? This also came in from the chat a little earlier. This is from Phil, DQ9MC, asking more about the relationship between Hezbollah and the government of Lebanon. Literally asking, is Hezbollah Lebanon? I think there's, some basic confusion out there as to what the relationship actually is and how powerful they are compared to each other.
Hezbollah is the most powerful military institution in Lebanon, but it's also a political party. It runs the airport, for example. So when I flew there, it was Hezbollah police, basically, who took my passport and gave me the little stamp and everything. So they are an established institution. They're way bigger than the Lebanese army. They control basically the south of the country, and they're supported by two forces, the Shia Muslims in Lebanon and by Iran. So that's where they get most of their funding from Iran and a little bit from Shia Muslim community within Lebanon. And so they're this strange entity that is like super powerful and can threaten war with a neighbor. And they basically, what they say goes in southern Lebanon, but they're only a minority political party in Lebanon. They had a majority for a while, but they lost it. And they're very unpopular among Christians, among Sunni Muslims, among secular Lebanese. And it's just very strange going to Beirut, which is like a modern, bustling metropolis with Christians and atheists, and nobody has to wear. It's not like a fundamentalist Muslim country, especially not in Beirut. And then you have this militia that is like dedicated to holy war, essentially. I mean, that's the rhetoric, but it's also interesting to see how the Lebanese, even they hate Hezbollah, they recognize that it's one of the most powerful functioning institutions in the country, and there's not that much you can do about it because Lebanese politics has a lot of dysfunction in it, and Hezbollah functions, basically. That's not a good thing, but people recognize that.
And let's just bring Rebecca back into this, Rebecca, because you've also spent some time in Lebanon. We know that Hezbollah did actually have a parliamentary majority up until 2022 and then lost it. But are they still very much in control of the country from where you're sitting?
I mean, there's certainly, I mean, as Amin was just saying, I mean, the fact that they are stronger than the Lebanese army or puts them also in, gives them a lot of control. And anecdotally, in terms of support, they don't have majority support in the country overall, as Amin was expressing there, with the Shia and Sunni and Christian communities rather, and obviously secular as well. But, the economy in Lebanon has been struggling so hard, and Hezbollah have they provide a lot of services. So there are members of the community. I mean, anecdotally, I was there in the aftermath of the blast, or I'll say actually the time that I was there a year later after the blast, actually more so. There were people I was speaking to who couldn't get medications.
The blast being at that port you're talking about.
Yes, sorry, that of course, yeah, the blast at the port in what was it now, 2020, I think it was, and so in around 2022, the economy is really struggling. It's completely bombing. People can't get medications, and you speak to people on the street who are like, oh, I'm looking for XYZ for my family member, and they would go to Dahir, the southern Shia neighborhood in Beirut where Hezbollah basically operate, to go to pharmacies there to get stuff because it was being brought in via Iran, for the Shia, for the support, for Hezbollah supporters, basically for their base, and other people also benefiting from that. So in some ways, people in Lebanon, because the government itself is so ineffectual for many, it does often rely on some of the support that Hezbollah has, but it certainly doesn't mean that people there agree with Hezbollah's policies and the way that they conduct themselves. They're grossly unpopular when you speak to people on the street.
And you did just mention that Iran, and also, I mean, you mentioned Hezbollah's links with Iran. The group has been very, very clear about its links with Iran, hasn't it?
Yeah, that's right. I don't know if we have this. Do we have the?
I think we have got.
That?
I think we've got a clip from Nasrallah. So that's again the head of the group of Hezbollah from 2016, which we can listen to now. Hopefully, Wade can play that to us.
نحن وعلى المكشوف، ويمكن هيك شيء بالعالم كله ما فيه، انه واحد يطلع علنا وشفاف وصادق وبيقول للعالم كله نحن يا خيي على راس السطح موازنة حزب الله ومعاشاته ومصاريفه وأكله وشربه وسلاحه وصواريخه من الجمهورية الإسلامية في إيران.
So that was, we obviously had subtitles there, but what he was saying was that everything comes from Iran. Mm-hmm. So very, very clearly spelt out then.
Yeah, I think that's a huge factor in this, because Hezbollah cannot win a war against Israel, not in any military terms that I know of, and I think Lebanese understand that. But the reason why Hezbollah can continue to threaten Israel is because it feels like Iran has its back. And Iran and Hezbollah fighting a war with Israel is something that definitely scares Israel. And then you have on top of that, if Iran gets involved and the US would get involved, and here's why I think a lot of people are very freaked out about this escalating conflict in the Middle East, because obviously if Hezbollah does something that triggers Israel to invade, then you're not talking about just a conflict on that border. You're talking about Iran possibly getting involved, the U.S. possibly getting involved, and all of a sudden you have a world war on your hands. I'm not saying that's going to happen, but that's why we're talking about it.
That's why people are particularly concerned.
People are worried about it, yeah.
Mm-hmm. You've talked about borders in terms of Israel wanting to protect its border, and Lebanon also, and Hezbollah down near that border. We have a question here from Levante David, who wants to know, is this war about territory, or is it more a war about religion? Not that it is a war, but this conflict between them right now. Mm-hmm.
Very interesting, and I think we can throw this also to our expert, and maybe Rebecca can weigh in on this too, because she spent a lot more time with Israelis on that side of the border. I think that I would say for Israel, it is about their territorial integrity. They want to protect their border, and that's what most people would tell you anyway. Obviously, there's very fundamentalist religious Israelis who see it as a holy war, just as fundamentalist Muslims on the Lebanese side would see it as a holy war. It's a lot harder for Hezbollah to say that it's territorial because because essentially they started this escalation with the attack after the Hamas attack, saying that it was solidarity with the Palestinian cause, which then begs the question, so is this ideological if you're getting involved? If you're attacking a country out of solidarity for another movement, then what are we talking about here? And Yeah, I think my take would be that Hezbollah itself is very ideological. You can see this since the very beginning in 1982 when they were conceived. They spoke in a language of revolution and anti-colonialism. They used that word colonialism all the time in their early doctrine. Sometimes you see pictures of Che Guevara next to Hassan Nasrallah because a lot of Shia Muslims in the area see this as liberation from colonial powers. Don't forget that Lebanon was under the control of French for a long time, and what is now Israel was a British mandate. So a lot of this modern conflict happened after the colonial powers left, and Hezbollah sees this as a continuation of that.
But it also seems to be mixed, too, because Hezbollah has called it a holy war, has called for the destruction of Israel. So there's territory involved in that. So these messages really seem to be mixed in many ways.
Sure.
Yeah.
Maybe, Rebecca, you would like to pitch in on that, just listening
I actually
to
think that was, I was just actually listening to what Amir had to say, and I thought, yeah, I would say that's pretty solid. Especially the post-colonial thing, I think is a really important factor that we can't put too much importance on, because this is something that, at the founding, as Abi was saying, when they were founded, this is something that they were saying that they, wanted to make sure that the French and the Americans were all out of there. It's a really big part of the puzzle. But I do think it is several things they're conflating as you're trying to make that point, Michelle. I think that's important for everyone to remember.
Thank you very much. Well, maybe just at this moment we will have a little check with Cherry to find out what's going on in the chat and if there are any particular repeating comments or themes that are coming out.
Yeah, there are some of them, actually, now that you mention it. First of all, many people express the wish that there would be no more war, that they hope that peace will happen anytime soon. But there are also questions about actually the roles of international power in this conflict between Israel and Hezbollah. For example, there is a question from Carolina Fellini that Michelle also mentioned. Does UN have any solutions to end these conflicts? There are also comments mentioning the role of the US and Iran and saying that this is a proxy war. They want to know more about this aspect.
OK, well, we are waiting for our guest, who is Makram Rabah, Assistant Professor at the American University of Beirut. But at the moment, we haven't managed to get hold of him, but hopefully we will hear from him soon. But just keeping that going, as you are sitting around this table, Amir, you're not allowed to escape, maybe we could just bring in about a question about the UN and the role, because the UN's role with Israel and Lebanon in the past has been strong, hasn't it? And it dates back a couple of decades.
Yeah. Let's go back to the map, actually, because I think that's really helpful to see where the border is and how this has to do with the possible scenarios for conflict. What's interesting is this is a map of the attacks. So the blue dots here are Israeli attacks in Lebanon, and the yellow dots are Hezbollah attacks on Israeli defense forces. And if you look at the line between the yellow and the blue, what you're seeing here is the blue line. This is the UN's established border between Lebanon and Israel. What's interesting is that you can't speak of this border as the same as the border of France and Germany, for example, because it isn't like a fixed point on the map. Things here can change. What it is the UN said after the 2006 war between Hezbollah and Israel, they drew this line and said, here's where the conflict ceases. And anybody who goes across this line is entering the other country's territory. Anybody who's on the other side of the line, it works both ways, basically.
And that line is called the
blue line.
The blue
That's
line.
right. And it's actually demarcated by blue barrels that are up on sticks. And what's interesting is that there's a fence along this.
We've got some pictures, actually, of those. If we can just show those pictures, because they really are barrels on sticks, aren't they? But sorry, keep going.
I thought we were going to play the video.
Oh, we are playing it, yeah.
This line represents the blue line, and don't cross it. because any crossing of the line means violation of the blue line.
People often think that the technical fence is the blue line and they can walk right up to it. Now this is absolutely wrong. The technical fence is not the blue line. But the most important thing is never cross the blue line.
That's something to remember. Do not cross the blue line, although it happens very often in terms of drones and missile strikes. But that's what is considered the unofficial rules of engagement. But what's interesting here is that the blue line exists. Both countries recognize it. They launch attacks very often on the other side. What you can see here is Israel goes way deeper into Lebanon than Hezbollah goes into Israel. Part of that is because of the sophistication of their weapons. A lot of
Can you
these
show
blue
us
dots,
again? Because I think we didn't see it on the screen yet. Show us again how far that went.
yeah. So this is Lebanon up here, and you can see the blue dots. These are Israeli attacks all the way up into northern Lebanon. There's several in Beirut. These are assassinations. I think this one was an assassination of a Hamas operative. This is just since October 7th. And you have this huge area of the south where Israel is striking with drones. Several journalists have been killed. Journalists' family members have been killed. A lot of these by drone, very sophisticated targeted drone attacks. Hezbollah has launched pretty deep inside Israel, but not as often. A lot of their attacks are limited to the border areas. And I think that reflects why you see such a higher death toll on the Lebanese side. But going back to the UN's role here, they established this border, but they also said when the war ended in 2006, was the war between Hezbollah and Israel, they tried to establish a demilitarized zone. Basically, the Lebanese army and the UN would patrol this area here that's near the border. So this is very general. Do not print this out and send it to anybody in Lebanon. But generally, an area around here would be considered demilitarized, and Hezbollah would not be allowed to enter this territory and launch attacks on Israel. But that obviously has not happened. Hezbollah goes right up to the fence, and sometimes Palestinian militant groups go as well. There's hundreds of thousands of Palestinian refugees living in Lebanon who are already also party to this conflict. They go right up to the border and sometimes shoot just like rifles across the border.
Do we know what the rules of engagement are for the UN peacekeeping troops that are there? I mean, these are guys from 49 different countries. There's like 10,000, right? Do we know what they're supposed to be doing?
That's a really good question. What I do know that they patrol the area, but it's very clear just from what I've heard from people in the area, and also when you're trying to travel to the area. When I was in Lebanon, in order to go down to the south, first you have to get permission from Hezbollah. You actually like call them up and say, hey, we were going on this date, can you have permission? They give you like a little, basically a little letter so that you can go in the area. So you don't ask the UN if you can go in the area, you ask Hezbollah. Yes. So that tells you what you need to know about who controls that area.
Okay. Thank you very much for that. We are very pleased now that we have got Makram Rabah, who is on down the line for us, assistant professor at the American University of Beirut. Thank you very much for joining us. We very much appreciate it. I would just like to go back about what we're talking about, whether further conflict could be avoided between Israel and Lebanon, and talk in a moment about what the scenarios could be there. But for you personally, living in Lebanon, in Beirut, does it feel different at the moment? Does it feel like possibly Lebanon is on the verge of a full-scale war, or is this just business as usual?
Well, actually, I was 1 year old when the Israelis invaded in '82. And I've been witness to a number of Israeli operations into Lebanon, all of them centered on Israel trying to get its security back. Unfortunately, I think all of these military operations has put people like me in a state of limbo, because every few years we are reminded that ultimately Lebanon lacks any sovereignty, and that whatever happens in the region, regional players are using the weakness as well as the diversity of Lebanon to weaponize it against the people of the region, be it the Israelis or even the Syrians to a certain extent. It's very hard to see part of your country being shelled where other parts are actually quote-unquote safe. However, the entirety of the country, or the idea of Lebanon, is no longer there for a number of reasons. First of all, we are witnessing one of the most worst economic collapse in the history of modern Lebanon. In addition to the fact that while many people look at Hezbollah as a local actor, for myself and my own personal experience with this Iranian-sponsored militia, it's that basically it's the tip of the spear for the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, which have basically dismantled many of the countries in the Levant, including my own country, Lebanon. This is why this gloomy atmosphere, or this so-called drums of war, makes it hard to concentrate and to live a life of normalcy, unfortunately.
So do you think further conflict between Israel is inevitable then?
Well, anyone who can tell you what will happen is basically lying to you. We have been following up on this conflict from day one. Everyone is hoping that this conflict will simply peter out, and that, ironically, Iran and Hezbollah are betting on Israeli democracy as well as US democracy, meaning that everyone is hoping that someone will topple Netanyahu and that basically someone more rational or more dovish will take over. However, I believe from following all the rhetoric from both sides, the October 7 fiasco and fallouts of the Hamas attack on Israel has transformed Israel into a kind of, I use it here as a very descriptive, as a rabid dog or a mad dog. They are willing to do anything to bring back the idea that they can protect themselves. And unfortunately, what happened with Hamas is completely different what's happening in Lebanon, meaning that the northern front, Israel has been preparing for a potential war with Hezbollah. And this is why the military establishment here has no problem going to war, because it's not only about politics, as some people might say. Everyone is saying that Netanyahu wants to go to war to prolong his political career. I think it's more deeper than that. Even if we don't have a full-scale confrontation, what has transpired in the last 8 months is enough to remind us that Lebanon is not even living next to the volcano. We are the actual volcano, which can stay dormant for centuries, but ultimately can kill us all. And this is something that we need to certainly take a step back and think about.
Makram, you said that Lebanon is the volcano, that conflict there could be tripped off. There's a lot of people on both sides who are ready for that. However, there is a comment here I'm going to read to you from one of our watchers here, Blip News, who says the U.S., Israel, and Iran are all in a proxy war. And he's saying these leaders do not want direct conflict. And this is my biggest question. Why?
Well, for over a decade, the Obama administration has been trying to convince the international community, and it has been able to do so, at least with the Europeans, trying to say that the most destructive element that Iran has is nuclear weapons. And this is why the nuclear deal was brokered in the idea that once we contain nuclear Iran, we can actually sit down and agree with them on other things. I think the last couple of years have proven that the real threat in the region for regional security as well as global security, as you see what's happening in Yemen with the Houthis, is basically that every country, Germany, for example, has a defense strategy. The strategy of Iran is basically, rather than allowing them to fight you in Iran, you fight them through a combination of proxy militias. Hezbollah here is not only a proxy militia. I tend to call them the strategic consultants of Iran, meaning that this outfit, who is basically lethal, not because they're Iranian, and here I say it with all due modesty, that because they're Lebanese, because they take advantage of the educational system and the diversity of the country, and the fact decentralized nature of the sectarian system has allowed them to become a very lethal and a potent tool for Iran. And this is why I think that Israel has realized that it cannot allow an entity like Hezbollah to be on its northern border, as well as operate many of the militias. So I think what the US administration has been thinking, that ultimately we can contain or we can fight limited proxy wars in the region, has proven ineffective, because Hamas, at the end of the day, actually jumped the gun on the Aqsa flood and implicated basically Iran in a war which it did not necessarily want to be this full scale.
So where, I just want to be clear then, where do you think this leaves Lebanon then? What scenarios could play out here?
Well, to be a bit pessimistic, ultimately Lebanon is not on the table. It's actually being served for lunch, meaning that whatever happens, whatever expires, if it's a full-scale war, and destruction will happen in different parts of Lebanon, not only in the south of Lebanon. Unfortunately, the international community, as well as the regional Gulf states, will not invest in a nation which is under the full hegemony and the control of Hezbollah. In 2006, when the 1701 United Nations Security Council Resolution 1701 was brokered, we had a kind of a government that used to be branded as pro-Western, and the international community, as well as the Gulf states, doubled down on relief and the reconstruction efforts. At the moment, Lebanon is much different since 2006. And unfortunately, I think what will happen that ultimately it will be a kind of a rogue state, because at the end of the day, our relationships are severed with the Gulf because of what was happening between Hezbollah and Iran on one side and the Gulf. And more recently, the statements of Hassan Nasrallah threatening Cyprus, for example, will only implicate Lebanon further and further and add to its isolation. And more importantly, I think that with what's happening in Ukraine and the entire globe, I think every country has different priorities.
I just want to pick up on one thing. You mentioned there the 1701 UN resolution, and that's what came off the back of that war in 2006, isn't it, between Israel and Lebanon?
Yeah.
Just to clarify.
Yes, of course.
I mean, what you're saying is it does sound pretty defeatist. I'd just like to bring in our correspondent, Rebecca Ritters, who is joining us as well. She is in Jerusalem. I mean, what does this sound like to you, Rebecca, of what Makram was just saying about the fact that, you know, for example, Lebanon will be served for lunch, could be eaten for lunch. It's just not a big player in this. It's just being used.
I mean, you couldn't see me, but when he said that, I had a little smirk on my face because, I mean, it's incredibly sad. And as somebody who has spent quite a bit of time in Lebanon and really does love the country and think it has so much to offer, that is certainly the received wisdom in the feeling that you have that Lebanon just doesn't, as a country, doesn't have a leg to stand on. Makram, I mean, is that accurate, do you think, to say? Is there anything that Lebanon, the state, can do in order to get out of the grip of Hezbollah?
While I might sound off as a bit defeatist or gloomy, I actually believe that this is an opportunity, because I think that we should acknowledge that we have been defeated in the sense that you cannot contain a militia like Hezbollah. You cannot have winter and summer under the same roof, so to speak. We try to duplicate the idea of having Hong Kong, which is an economic prosperity, next door having a Hanoi where you can keep on fighting and killing. That doesn't work. So I believe that going back to the basics, meaning that while people are scared from ending this diverse system, I think the way to protect this diversity is to reestablish the idea of sovereignty. And rather than the Lebanese themselves are to blame for allowing something like Hezbollah to mutate their political system, we have a century-old problem that this system hasn't been living up to the idea of state building. And unfortunately, what we're seeing, and my problem is with many of these militias in the region, if you destroy Hamas or Hezbollah, you don't know what monster would come out of this. Ultimately, as a modern citizen of the 21st century, I want the rule of law. And one important thing, I don't say this lightly, the Arab-Israeli conflict should be solved on just premises. The idea of allowing Hamas to hijack the Palestinians for a legitimate cause. The problem with Hezbollah, Hamas, and all of these, they take legitimate demands, but they hijack them for a different course. Unfortunately, and I say this also with a bit of accuracy, Netanyahu and Nasrallah and all of these people, they belong to the same school. That might is right. For me, the pillars of a proper Lebanese, a modern Lebanon for my family or for myself, is a Lebanon built on justice. And unfortunately, this is not nowhere to be found. But it doesn't mean that we should stop fighting for that.
I have a question for Makram.
Well, we still see no justice for the people who were affected by that blast that we were just talking about in 2020. Still no justice seen there. And but just quickly to clarify for people who may not be aware, by the power sharing agreement, you're talking, of course, about the confessional system where every sect plays a different role, right? Maybe you could clarify that.
In a way, but the problem is that this sectarian system, which goes back to the 19th century, was not modernized in the sense that allow proper participation. And the problem is that these people people who are the feudal lords who are in power. Basically, they belong to the, like, you're talking about people who resemble like the Junkers back in the 18th century Prussia. These people, unfortunately, don't take responsibility for many of their actions. When you hear them talk, you think that they are members of the opposition, while in fact many of these people have been in power for the last 3 decades or even more.
I'd love to just hear from
Yeah,
Amir. I think Amir wants to put a question to you as well.
Yeah, just to follow up on what Makram said. Basically, Makram, you said that Hezbollah, when you're being pessimistic, is just the spearhead of Iran's regional power. And you said that Lebanon is being served up on the plate, basically, for the sake of this greater conflict. But 2 things that I noticed when I was in Lebanon. The first is that Hezbollah does have support there among Shia Muslims, but also this sense of like the downtrodden. They play into this ideology of we're protecting the people that don't have a voice. They offer social services and things like this. And so that's one thing. What can you tell me about the? Can you tell us about the support in Lebanon? The second thing is. Well, sorry, I'll let you answer that first one. That's a big enough question.
Well, technically, I tend to disagree with the idea of having support. Definitely, they do have some sort of grassroots support, but how can you actually gauge this? Is the electoral ballot boxes enough? Because at the end of the day, you're not allowed to run against them. And many of the regions are outside the rule of law. And more or so here, and I have proof to accuse them of running a narco state. Between Lebanon and Syria and the Assad regime, these people are responsible for manufacturing amphetamines and smuggling them to the Gulf. More so, also, the idea is that these people are somewhat responsible as a political party and as a militia for the August 4 Beirut blast. So, and more so, the gentleman in the background is my good friend Luqman Slim, a human rights activist who was killed in the south of Lebanon in a region controlled by Hezbollah. Many of the people that has fallen victim to these political assassinations were all anti-Hezbollah, anti-Iran, and they fell victim. So ultimately, I would not treat Hezbollah as a political actor. If Hezbollah was indeed a political actor, we wouldn't be in this situation, because the obsession of Hezbollah, their DNA, was formed out of revolutionary guard. And this is why their ultimate aim is to continue operating whatever happens, living to fight another day. Certainly, they use a sectarian system, as you mentioned, the idea talking on behalf of the Shiites, and they technically hide behind the Shiites. If you notice what's happening, the Israelis are playing it very smart in the sense that most of these surgical hits are trying to avoid civilians. But this doesn't mean that moving forward, they will not do what they did in Gaza, because simply at the end of the day, they can get away with murder. And Hezbollah also tend to say that we don't care. We are representing people who want to liberate Palestine. But what we have proven in the last 8 months, that Iran is not really invested in Palestine, but rather invested in its own Shiite sectarian brand of Shiism in the region. This is why they always tend to use the Arabs of the region to protect their own interests back in Iran.
Can I jump in here with a question from the chat for you, Makram? We've been talking about scenarios that could possibly happen between Israel and Hezbollah and a lot of the players involved. A question from Sam O is, beyond Iran and the U.S., are there other countries or entities that could get involved on either side and influence what's going to happen next?
Well, I just like to point out that recently, through many of its mouthpieces, Hezbollah and Iran has hinted to the fact that maybe Taliban wanted to join the fight. So in a way, the so-called axis of resistance, or the Iranian axis, has the ability to disrupt many of the regional security. I need to remind you that when your Amazon package is late, it's because the Houthis are holding everyone hostage with the Hormuz Straits. So in the end of the day, yes, they have the ability to disrupt and to cause problems. And ultimately, we have seen how many of their sabotage operations can lead to many of the Western countries basically being mobilized to try to stop these cells or the idea. And more or less, if we do get to the sectarian tension, remember that ISIS and Al-Qaeda and all of these people justified their rise to the fact that Iran controls many of the regions, basically Iraq, and we've seen how this sectarian conflict was very destructive. Yes, we have a number of problems if this continues, and certainly I think I don't want to blame the U.S. administration on this, but someone has to lead. There's actually a lack of responsibility from the Biden administration, because ultimately they should double down on the Middle East, because everyone knows that since Biden was in the White House, he simply pivoted towards the Orient. And this has led to a kind of a power vacuum. And Ukraine and Russia and everything that's happening around us is an anonymous sign that we need to go back to normalcy at whatever cost, without shedding more blood.
And let me just pick up on that. With talking about the US and somebody needs to leave, we've had a flurry of diplomatic visits, including to Lebanon, including the German foreign minister who was there just yesterday. Is that making a difference? Is diplomacy working, or are we beyond that from what you seem to be saying?
Well, I think many of these diplomats, including the German foreign minister, simply don't want to invest in the relief efforts if actually war breaks out or reconstruction. So they're trying to preempt the conflict. But I think it's too little too late, because the real person that can do change, and here I'm not putting all the eggs on one basket, is the U.S. Special Envoy, Amos Hochstein. Amos Hochstein now has an offer on the table for the Israelis, but the Israelis don't actually trust that Hezbollah will honor their part of the deal, which is basically withdraw their troops south of the Litani River and basically kind of do a rehash of the 1701. And this will include the peacekeepers who I was listening to you. The peacekeepers are basically hostages for Hezbollah and Israel, in the sense that these people don't have a clear rules of engagement, and many of they just monitor and report. So what I think basically that this is only a band-aid solution for a much bigger hemorrhaging wound. So we need to go back, and first of all, you have the refugee problem. Many of these issues you can't just throw money at. One has to basically go back to the idea that we have a problem in Syria. Iran equally and Hezbollah are much involved in Syria itself and in Iraq. So we need to go back and try to, in a way, detox the whole environment, not only try to isolate Lebanon, because the problem is not only Lebanon and in Gaza, but rather the whole mood which is engulfing the world at the moment.
But how do you do that? How do you detox that whole area? I mean, it's proved to be so complex, so difficult for decades, for centuries.
In the sense, Lebanon, for example, rather than trying to give you a kind of what we call a beauty pageant response, it's not about world peace, but for example, in the case of Lebanon, by reconstructing the political system, at the moment we have no president. The presidency has been vacant even before October 7th. So reconstructing this, putting people back in elected office, reforming and restructuring the economic system, at least this is in the case of Lebanon, enough to make you more appealing to the international community. This also applies to Syria. At least within my own neighborhood, if I open the window, I want a president who can actually speak on our behalf. It's not proper for the foreign minister of Germany to come and speak to the Speaker of Parliament. She has to go to the presidential palace and meet an elected official, as well as a cabinet that has the confidence and the vote of the Speaker of the Parliament. This is how democracies work. And I think that rather than blaming everything on the Arab-Israeli conflict, many of the nations are to blame for failing in building proper states. Many of the states are good. We love them. Food is good. Coming here is good, as many of the people pointed out. But ultimately, the elephant in the room is that people are not taking charge of their own future, but rather betting that everything will be solved by the European Union or the US or even the Arab Gulf with its oil money. This doesn't work. This doesn't build you nations. It just gives you an opportunity to breathe until you are suffocated again.
We just heard here in the chat talking about the stakes that are involved in this conflict. DeVos says we're all just a misunderstanding away from World War III. So sad. Do you think we're really to that point, Makram?
No, not really. I think there's a number of these are fighting words. Many of the people use them as a tactic, and I ultimately believe that Nasrallah is trying to scare, and he's very good at scare tactics and psychological warfare, because contrary to what I believe, I think that he doesn't really have the technical skills, but he has the ability to disrupt the situation. So he's trying to use these words and many of his operations as a kind of deterrence. But the problem, we don't have the MAD model, the mutual assured destruction model, and we don't have the Cold War. We are basically trying to replicate the past rather than having people think outside the box. So definitely there's the potential of war breaking out. And the problem is that we are not running, this is not a science, meaning that people mess up, people might jump the gun if they end up taking the decision as they have been hinting that they might actually go after Nasrallah and all of this. This might change the whole ballgame. Ultimately, war is knocking at our door, but at the same time, we are in the midst of the war. So it's a mixed war, basically.
So in answer to our question then that we've put for this week's news desk, can Israel and Lebanon avoid further conflict? From what you seem to be saying, the answer is no.
Yes, in a way, giving the tools at our disposal and the way that people are operating, I think that it's inevitable, but doesn't mean that we cannot avoid it if we have if we end up changing not the rules of the game, but basically understanding what is at stake, and in a way getting more international support, and rather than just being proactive, put something real on the table. We can't just avoid the elephant in the room. First of all, we have to acknowledge we have a much bigger problem, and basically just like many of the countries have realized that either they put their money where their mouth is, or they just stop coming to Lebanon. We don't want to internationalize this idea if people don't really invest on the long run. The problem with the international community is that they don't run a marathon. They just run a sprint. And this has allowed Iran and its agents to actually take advantage of this. So if you don't like whoever is in power in Germany, you wait for the second election or the third election and something will change. So people have to realize that you have to be in this for the long run.
I'm curious. Yeah, go ahead. Actually, I want to hear what Rebecca has to say.
Okay, Rebecca, you go first. There's a cue.
Sorry, I just wanted to ask you because, you know, I tend to agree that we're sort of heading towards some kind of inevitable conflict. And I'm just wondering what you think could be put on the table to avoid that, because certainly the rhetoric here in Israel, and certainly from the people I've spoken to at the border, and I don't know whether you heard me saying it before, is there's a, you know, I think this resolution 1701 has never really been fully implemented, certainly not from the Israeli perspective. And many residents here, as well as the government, are frustrated with that. And I spoke to so many people who said they wouldn't move back to those border towns unless there was an actual military conflict, that a political solution wouldn't be strong enough because it's been ignored in the past. So I'm just wondering what you see as a potential political solution way out.
Well, the key word here is political. Many of the solutions which have been used in the past are not political. They are security or intelligence-minded solutions for a political problem. So rather than just trying to contain and give Hezbollah legitimacy, ironically, in 2006, Hezbollah did not win the military confrontation. It was able to win a kind of political confrontation and get the legitimacy from the fact that Lebanon in 2006 had the economy to sustain the war, or we had a kind of safety net from the international community and the Arab Gulf. Ultimately, I think going back to the idea that the Palestinians should get their own state, we cannot allow for a kind of an open air prison like Gaza to allow for elements like Hamas to cause another October 7. And ultimately, rather than allowing Netanyahu to be normalized as a normal politician, we should also remember that we should not disregard the main idea that many of these people hide behind the Arab-Israeli conflict. So resolving the Arab-Israeli conflict or putting back the peace process on the table would empower voices of liberal thought, people who are actually persecuted and attacked, such as myself, for suggesting that violence is not the way forward.
I wanted to actually ask
well, actually,
you.
I just touching. Oh, sorry.
No, I'm just with you saying, including yourself. I was thinking when you were talking in such strong terms about Hezbollah and Iran, whether you are yourself under threat with speaking out from Lebanon.
Well, a couple of months ago, it was the fourth time they tried to arrest me and to accuse me of being an Israeli agent just for speaking out against Hezbollah. As I told you, my good friend was killed and many of my friends were killed by Hezbollah. And I can tell you that I don't go around a lot because simply as a university professor, I cannot afford to have a security detail with me all the time. And this is not only myself. Many people who remain silent do so because they're afraid of being branded as Israeli agents, or simply they don't want to be knifed like Salman Rushdie was. So yes, the intellectual class in Lebanon, even those who are more moderate, cannot speak out because Lebanon, that was an oasis for freedom and liberal thought, is ultimately now monitored by Hassan Nasrallah and Hezbollah, who say that nothing is more important than the beat of the drum. And this is why we all have to march towards war. And this is something I have refused, and I refuse to double down on violence where we can actually hope or also dream of potential peace.
The rhetoric coming from Nasrallah is extremely bellicose, as you just said, the beating of the war drum. But just looking at the numbers, which is something that occurred to me when I was both in Lebanon and Israel over the past few months, on the Israeli side, 10 civilians have been killed and 15 soldiers in all of these hundreds of attacks that we saw on the map. On the Lebanese side, 349 Hezbollah operatives have been killed, 64 operatives from Palestinian groups or other militant groups in Lebanon, and 83 civilians by the latest count. When I was in Israel, I think Hezbollah struck an IDF area, a base there, killed one reservist, and then Israel retaliated with precision drone attacks and killed multiple Hezbollah operatives as well as family members. A grandmother and two children ended up in the hospital. One of the children died. When I look at these numbers, I think actually it's Hezbollah that seems the most afraid of a full-out war, that whenever an attack like this happens, they're okay to say, we're back to the status quo. We killed one Israeli soldier. They killed 3 or 4 civilians in Lebanon, plus several high-ranking Hezbollah members, but we're even now. Is that false, or how do these numbers end up this way?
It's actually very accurate because simply the Israelis have learned since 2006 many of their surveillance and their technology. Ultimately, the IDF is using AI and big data. They have been using facial recognition, voice recognition. Hezbollah's entry into the civil war in Syria and in Iraq transformed them from a guerrilla operation outfit to a traditional army. This is what the Israelis wanted to begin with, because it's easier for them to fight Hezbollah. To add to this, Hezbollah have been suffering, meaning that the people that you mentioned, the 300-something, half of them are the field commanders, which keep it's the glue that keeps the whole militia going. So ultimately what is happening here, that these people who are killed, including people like Qasem Soleimani, you can't just get them from the military academy. These people have been killing for the last 3-4 decades, and they need operational experience, which is Hezbollah cannot just feed a new generation of fighters. This is why, as you mentioned, every time they try to retaliate, it's the idea that this could be also a face-saving operation and the Israelis will just back away. This won't happen because the debate within the IDF and the intelligence community in Israel is somewhere else. These people are still operating pre-October 7, whereas the Israelis are talking about a new approach to the challenge of Lebanon.
That's really interesting. I think that that is exactly the rhetoric I heard in Israel. Maybe Rebecca can also back that up. Basically, what I heard in Israel is there's a general failure to acknowledge that Israel was striking Lebanon, and of course, in the media it comes across, but a lot of the people that I talked to were, every time an Israeli was killed, it was like, we need to go to war with Lebanon. I mean, this is generalization, but that's the kind of level of conversation I was hearing.
Most certainly. I mean, when you speak to people, I was just in Haifa recently just to see how people were feeling after that video that we showed a little bit of, the drone video that Hezbollah released, allegedly saying that they'd been flying a drone over, showing areas that they, could and would attack should Israel go to war with them. And, that was very much what I was, hearing people saying is like, we have to be able to let those citizens go back to their houses. We have to do something to end this Hezbollah threat. And everyone I spoke to actually also had full confidence in the Israeli military. They said, I said, even given what happened with October 7, there are some people who say, well, maybe the Israeli military isn't as strong as everyone had always perceived. It was certainly a bit of a shock, a huge shock, a fundamental shock, actually, to Israelis that such an attack was able to happen. And then everyone still feels completely protected by the Israeli military, and they feel like they will be protected and that Israel would win any confrontation with Hezbollah. When you speak to the Israeli military, I mean, they're very pragmatic about the capabilities of Hezbollah, and they are concerned. And in a briefing that we had way back in the beginning of the war with Hamas about Hezbollah, when it looked like things could certainly spill over even then, you had the Israeli military saying it is a different kettle of fish. And of course, we know that Hezbollah are a much different, a much more advanced group than Hamas, and they will be able to inflict a lot more civilian damage within the country. And also, but that the military, that the military would then have to make decisions about what they could protect, because they would have to be looking for big infrastructure targets that they would be needing to protect, where they may not be able to protect, certain civilian areas. So that they were very serious about that threat and taking it very seriously. But I think most Israelis feel as though that Israel would come out on top.
And it's the exact opposite in Beirut, right? I mean, among at least non-Hezbollah supporters, there's the feeling that they would lose the war, it would destroy the country that's already on its last legs. I was talking to one guy who was joking. He was telling me, "Oh, I'm learning how to swim." I thought he was serious, but I could tell he was joking. I was like, "What do you mean?" He's like, "Well, when the war starts, I'm swimming out into the sea and never coming back." And I mean, it's funny, but it's also serious. I think a lot of people are acknowledge that the Israeli military can do severe damage to Lebanon.
To add, there was this joke that I think one minister in the Israeli cabinet was saying that if Hezbollah hits any of our power factories, we will make sure that Lebanon will lose its electricity. And the joke was, we don't have electricity to begin with. What are you going to destroy? So there's nothing actually to lose but the idea of Lebanon, because ultimately, if we continue on allowing Hezbollah to operate out of Lebanon and to basically threaten global affairs, Lebanon will be branded as Hezbollah land rather than Lebanon. So we don't want this. And unfortunately, I think part of it is from the fault of the political establishment, which have used Hezbollah to hide from the fact that these people are corrupt and they have been using Lebanese resources to stay in power. And ultimately, when we went to the streets on the 17th of October 2019 to try to topple the regime, it was Hezbollah that basically stopped us, because ultimately there is a kind of a Faustian deal between corruption and Iranian weapons. And this is something that we need to address. I always say there's a herd of elephants in the room, corruption, sectarianism, but there's one elephant which is armed. So it's basically the priorities of dismantling this bomb without blowing up in our faces.
And on that point, thank you very much, Makram Rabah, for joining us and for staying with us for much longer than I said you would. So we really appreciate all of that, your insights and also just the situation that you yourself are finding yourself in. So thank you very much for joining us. We do appreciate it. And just before I let you go, Rebecca, just love to get a very final thought on what you have just heard there from Makram. Did some of that, was that surprising to hear somebody speaking so openly about the situation that Lebanon itself is finding itself in?
Yes and no. I mean, no from my personal experience, because when you're in Lebanon and you talk to people, they are very open and they will speak rather openly with you. But yes, to speak publicly like this, it's interesting. I actually saw an interview that Makram did the other day, and I was discussing it last night or the night before with some people talking about this issue, and they said, I was explaining what Makram had been saying in this interview, and they said, "Whoa, like, God, is he worried about his personal safety?" And I very cavalierly said, and so that's actually the question I was going to ask Alex to Makram. And so thank you for asking that question about his personal safety, because I was sort of cavalier and said, "Oh, there are plenty of people that criticize Hezbollah," and I really didn't think about it in the fact that yes, but not so publicly. And so I think it's not surprising, but perhaps it is surprising to be hearing it so openly and so in this sort of public forum.
Thank you so much,
But
Rebecca.
I'm not surprised by the content of what he had to say. I think it's
because
really
you've been covering
sadly accurate.
Yeah. Thank you, Rebecca, again for all your insights. We appreciate you being with us again for a long time, much longer than I said. So thank you very much.
Okay.
Really appreciate it. We probably need to get the poll result, don't we?
Right, yeah, I closed it quite some time ago. But
oh, did you?
Yeah, our discussion has been going so well, so I guess I understand. Our poll results, we have 646 votes. Most people, which is 38%, think Israel. Again, let me repeat the question. The escalation on the Lebanon-Israel border rests in whose hands? 36% of the votes go to Israel. 23% say conflict is inevitable. 23% says it's Hezbollah, and 14% says it's US and Iran. And actually, someone put a comment saying that we should separate US and Iran. That's something that we didn't go into so deep in the discussion, but I appreciate the comment. And yeah, we will try to improve our choice in our poll questions.
We need more choices, you mean, more than four. Right. One last takeaway from this very rounded discussion from you.
Yeah, Makram used a word at the end of what he was saying, saving face. And that was a word that I was looking for the whole time, but I'm glad he said it, because I think on both sides, a political solution probably could be achieved if they found a way to save face. That's really, for a lot of people, that's what it's about. Obviously, Israel wants to secure its border. I do think, like, after what we've talked about in this discussion, it does seem pretty apparent that Hezbollah also wants a way out of a larger conflict, or might be able to take that chance. And I just think that people who are calling for peace are hoping that that prevails, that somebody finds some way to save face. And I was interested in the idea that Hezbollah has always said that they're going to continue this until the conflict in Gaza winds down. And ironically, the moment that Netanyahu announces that they're going to focus on the northern border, he also announces that they're winding down the conflict in Gaza. So I'm just wondering if that might be a way out. That's obviously a discussion for a whole new news desk.
That is.
So bookmark that one, come back to us next week. But that was just my final thought.
Thank you, Amien. Really appreciate it. Thank you to everyone for all your great comments and questions. We very much appreciate you. We will see you next week.
That's right. We'll be back next Wednesday. We always put our question out about 24 hours ahead of time. So make sure that you check out our community post so you know what that is, and then you'll be ready to tune in.
Yeah, great. Thank you. We'll see you next week. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.